March 14th, 2021, Glenville, Oregon. Population 8,247. A forgettable town where the most exciting event in recent memory was when someone spotted a black bear near the grocery store. But at exactly 3:47 a.m., every single person in Glenville woke up at the same instant. Sarah Mitchell's eyes snapped open. Her husband was already sitting upright, his hand reaching for her shoulder. His mouth was moving, forming her name over and over. She could see the panic in his eyes, but she heard nothing, not his voice, not the sound of her own gasp. She clapped her hands together hard enough to sting. Silence. She screamed until her throat burned. Nothing. The realization hit her like ice water. The world had gone completely, impossibly silent. Officer Tom Harrison was mid-sentence when it happened. He was talking to his partner about the Blazers game, and then his own voice just vanished mid-word. The police radio was cycling through static on the display, lights blinking normally, but producing absolutely no sound. He tapped his ear, thinking maybe he'd gone deaf. But then he noticed his partner frozen in place, staring at his own hands as he clapped them together, again and again, his face draining of color. Within 10 minutes, the streets filled with people in pajamas and bathrobes. Hundreds, then thousands converging on Main Street. Some were holding their phones up with messages. "Can you hear anything?" Others were pointing at their ears, shaking their heads. An elderly man was methodically smashing a glass bottle against the pavement, watching the shards scatter in perfect, terrifying silence. Jennifer Park, a high school science teacher, was standing on her porch watching a wind chime swinging violently in the breeze. The metal tubes were colliding. She could see the impacts, but they produced no sound, not even a whisper. She pulled out her phone and played a video of her daughter's birthday party from last week. The video played normally. She could see everyone singing, but the audio was completely gone. Then she realized something worse. It wasn't just her video. Every recording, even YouTube videos were playing with perfect visuals, but zero sound. By sunrise, 8,000 people stood in the town square in a silence so complete it felt like being underwater. That's when 12-year-old Marcus Webb noticed something that made his blood run cold. His dog was barking at a squirrel in a tree, body convulsing with the effort, mouth wide open. But the squirrel wasn't reacting at all. It just sat there, completely calm, as if it could still hear that there was no sound to fear, as if the silence was only affecting humans. And in that moment, everyone realized the same horrible truth. This wasn't natural. This was deliberate. Something had taken away their sound. The question was why. By 9 a.m., Highway 101 was packed with cars trying to leave Glenville. People were fleeing in panic, desperate to escape whatever had stolen their sound. But then something impossible happened that stopped the exodus completely. Marcus Chen was driving his family north when his daughter suddenly grabbed his arm, her eyes wide. She was pointing ahead at something that made no sense. He pulled over and got out. 20 feet in front of them, a man was standing in the middle of the road with 1 foot forward and 1 foot back, perfectly balanced on the center line. And he was laughing, actually laughing out loud. The man's name was David Reeves. He'd stumbled onto the boundary by accident. He stood there demonstrating it to the growing crowd, stepping backward into sound, then forward into silence, back and forth. Each time he crossed the line, his expression changed from relief to horror. People began walking up to him, testing it themselves. You could stand with one hand in silence and one hand holding a ringing phone that you could actually hear. The boundary wasn't gradual. It was a wall, an invisible, perfect wall. Within 2 hours, someone had driven the entire perimeter, 4 kilometers from the town center. Exactly. Not 4.1, not 3.9. A perfect circle, mathematically precise, as if drawn with a compass by something that understood geometry better than nature ever could. Sarah Mitchell stood at the eastern boundary with her husband, both of them crying. They could hear each other now. After 6 hours of silence, the sound of her husband's voice saying, "I love you," made her break down completely. But their house was inside the zone. Their whole life was in there. She looked back at the town, visible in the distance, where thousands of people were moving through the streets in that horrible silence. Some families were already setting up tents on the outside, refugees from their own town. Dr. Rachel Foster arrived just after noon. She was a physicist from Portland State who'd been doom-scrolling Twitter when Glenville started trending worldwide. Now she stood at the southern boundary with a decibel meter, watching it perform an impossible trick. She held it at arm's length and slowly moved it across the invisible line. The needle sat at 58 decibels in the normal world. Then, in the space of less than an inch, it dropped to 0. Not to 5, not to 1, to absolute 0. She spent the next 3 hours running experiments, and each one made less sense than the last. She placed microphones on both sides of the boundary and played a tone generator inside the silent zone. Her oscilloscope showed the sound waves clearly. They existed. They moved through the air normally, propagating exactly as physics said they should. But when those waves reached a microphone or a human ear, something intercepted them, filtered them out. It was like someone had installed an impossible firewall between sound and perception. Then her graduate student James made a discovery that changed everything. He'd caught a sparrow just outside the boundary and brought it across in a small cage. The bird kept chirping normally. More than that, it was clearly reacting to sounds. When James snapped his fingers silently inside the zone, the bird turned its head toward the sound. He dropped a metal pan. The bird startled and fluttered. Whatever was blocking human perception wasn't affecting animals at all. They tested it with a dog. Same result. A cat. Same thing. The animals moved through the silent zone as if nothing was wrong, hearing sounds that 8,000 humans couldn't perceive. Rachel stood there trying to process the implications. This wasn't jamming. This wasn't some broad interference. This was targeted, specifically at humans, at human ears and human technology. By evening, Glenville had become the center of the world. News helicopters circled overhead. Satellite trucks lined every approach road. Rachel watched a CNN reporter standing at the boundary, describing the scene to a camera while behind her, barely visible in the fading light, the silent town looked like something from a post-apocalyptic film. Then the military arrived. At exactly 7 p.m., a convoy of black vehicles rolled up to the southern perimeter. Not National Guard, not local response. These were unmarked vehicles with sophisticated equipment. Soldiers deployed in formation, professional and fast. A colonel stepped out, older, gray-haired, and walked straight to the boundary with a device Rachel had never seen before. He scanned the invisible barrier for 30 seconds, his expression completely neutral. Then he pulled out a satellite phone, walked 20 feet away, and made a call. Rachel was close enough to hear part of it. The colonel's voice was quiet, but clear. "It's confirmed, same signature as Yakutsk." Then he listened for a moment and said, "No, sir, this one's stronger." Rachel felt her stomach drop. Yakutsk, Russia. She pulled out her phone and searched. Nothing recent. Nothing about silence. But then she found it, buried in a tech forum from 8 months ago. Reports of a dead zone outside Yakutsk where radio equipment failed for 3 days. Official explanation: solar flare interference. But the description matched. A perfect circle, sudden onset. Then it just stopped. She looked back at the colonel. He was staring into the silent zone with the expression of someone who knew exactly what he was looking at and didn't like it one bit. That night, Rachel sat in her van reviewing data. She'd measured everything: electromagnetic fields, radiation, barometric pressure, air composition, all normal. But then she analyzed the acoustic spectrum in detail and found something that shouldn't exist. There was a carrier wave, an artificial signal broadcasting at exactly 23.8 kilohertz, just above the range of human hearing. It was perfectly uniform across the entire 4-kilometer zone, precise to within a fraction of a hertz. This wasn't natural. This was engineered. Someone had built a device capable of generating a flawless 4-kilometer sphere and selectively filtering human audio perception within it. The technology required was decades beyond anything publicly known. She sat back, her mind racing. Then her equipment beeped. The carrier wave had changed. It pulsed once, a gap, 2 pulses, another gap, 3 pulses. It was cycling, a rhythm. Rachel's hands started shaking as she realized what she was looking at. It wasn't random. It wasn't interference. It was structured, intentional. Something was counting, and she had no idea what would happen when it reached 0. Day 3. The silence continued, and people were breaking. Rachel woke up in her van to find a crowd gathered at the southern boundary. Families who'd been camping outside the zone for 3 days, waiting for the silence to end, waiting to go home. But it wasn't ending. In the previous events, Yakutsk and the others, 72 hours had been the limit. The silence had always stopped by now. A woman named Jennifer was standing at the boundary line, 1 foot in silence, 1 foot in sound, screaming into the zone at her husband, who stood 20 feet away inside. He was mouthing words back to her, holding up their daughter, who was crying silently in his arms. Jennifer had left to get help on day 1. He'd stayed behind to watch the house. Now the boundary might as well have been an ocean between them. Rachel watched as Jennifer finally crossed back into the silence, choosing 3 days without sound over 3 more hours separated from her family. She wasn't the only one. People were making the choice: community or communication. You couldn't have both. That's when the black SUV arrived. 2 men in suits, no badges, asked Rachel very politely to come with them. She almost refused until one of them said, "We know what's happening here, and we know it's happened before." They drove her to a command post 3 miles out. Inside a large tent, Rachel found herself facing a woman who introduced herself as Dr. Khatri. No agency, no affiliation, just a name. Behind her, the walls were covered with satellite images, and on one of them, Rachel saw red circles marked over 4 other locations around the world. Dr. Khatri saw her staring. "Glenville isn't the first," she said quietly. "Svalbard, Norway, 18 months ago. Yakutsk, Russia, 8 months ago. Tasmania, 3 months ago. All of them perfect 4-kilometer circles. All of them complete audio dead zones. All of them lasted exactly 72 hours and then stopped." Rachel felt the room tilt. Why didn't anyone report this? Why isn't this global news? Svalbard was a research station, 12 people. We classified it as equipment failure. Yakutsk was remote enough that we contained it. Tasmania was uninhabited forest. We got lucky. Dr. Khatri pulled up an image of Glenville from space. But this, 8,000 people in American suburbs with cell phones? We can't contain this, which is why we need to understand it. Now. She zoomed in on the thermal image. At the exact center of Glenville, there was a cold spot, a perfect circle reading 15 degrees colder than everything around it. Something is generating this, something physical, and it's located right here. She pointed to the center of town, near the old church on Maple Street. Rachel stared at the image. You think there's a device? Someone built this? Dr. Khatri pulled up another image. Sonar scan from the Pacific Ocean, dated 1 month ago. We found one. 4 weeks ago, middle of the ocean, same phenomenon. We sent a ship to investigate. The image showed a sphere on the ocean floor, metallic, perfectly smooth. When they tried to retrieve it, the sphere emitted an electromagnetic pulse that fried every system on the vessel. They barely made it back. Rachel's mouth went dry. So, whoever built this, they don't want us touching it. Correct. Dr. Khatri leaned forward. Which is why we need someone to go into Glenville, locate the device, and tell us what we're dealing with. Someone who isn't military. Someone the locals might actually trust. Rachel looked at the map, at the cold spot over the church, and realized what they were asking. You want me to find it? We need you to find it. 3 hours later, Rachel was back at the boundary with James and 2 other grad students, loading equipment into a van. Battery powered only, no wireless. They were going dark. Sarah Mitchell saw them preparing to cross and walked over, holding a handwritten sign. Are you going to fix this? Rachel looked at her, at the desperation in her eyes, and realized she had no idea what to write back. Instead, she just nodded. Sarah's face crumpled with relief, or maybe it was just hope. Rachel couldn't tell anymore. At 4 p.m., they drove across the boundary into silence. The town had changed. 3 days of silence had transformed it into something alien. People had stopped trying to talk. They moved through the streets like ghosts, communicating only in gestures and hastily scrawled notes. Some houses had whiteboards in the yards with messages for family outside. We're staying. Don't worry. Come home. But other houses were empty, dark, abandoned by people who couldn't take it anymore. Rachel's team drove straight to Maple Street. The old church sat there, white paint peeling, surrounded by a small cemetery with graves dating back to the 1800s. They unloaded the equipment and started scanning. Ground-penetrating radar, thermal imaging, electromagnetic sensors. For 90 minutes, they found nothing. Then James grabbed Rachel's arm and pointed at his radar screen. He'd been scanning the cemetery, and beneath a grave dated 1987, the radar showed something impossible. A hollow space 15 feet down, and inside it, something metallic, something that definitely wasn't a coffin. Rachel knelt beside the grave and refined the scan. The image sharpened, a sphere, 2 meters in diameter, radiating heat in steady pulses that matched exactly with the carrier wave frequency she'd been tracking. They'd found it. She looked at James, then at the church, then at the town around them, drowning in silence. They'd found the source, but now what? They had no way to communicate with the outside world. no way to dig it up without heavy equipment, and no idea what this thing would do if disturbed. That's when she noticed the animals. A dog tied up outside a nearby house was pulling frantically at its leash, whining silently, desperate to escape. Birds that had been flying normally over the town for 3 days were now veering away at the boundary, refusing to enter. A cat streaked past them, running full speed toward the edge of town. The animals could still hear, and whatever they were hearing now was terrifying them. Rachel checked her spectrum analyzer. The carrier wave had changed. It was no longer pulsing in that steady rhythm. It was accelerating, building, the frequency climbing higher and higher. She looked at her watch. 6:47 p.m. Exactly 72 hours since the silence began. This was when it should have stopped, when Yakutsk went quiet, when Tasmania returned to normal. 72 hours, and then it was over. But the signal wasn't stopping. It was getting stronger. At 6:55 p.m., Rachel felt it, a pressure in her chest. Like standing too close to a subwoofer, feeling bass you couldn't hear but could feel in your bones. James felt it too. He was holding his hand over his heart, his face pale. The sphere beneath them was doing something, building toward something. At exactly 7 p.m., every light in town went out, not gradually, all at once. Street lights, house lights, car headlights, traffic signals. Everything electrical died in the same instant. Rachel's equipment went dark. The van wouldn't start. Even her battery-powered flashlight died in her hand. The town was now in complete darkness and complete silence. And then Rachel saw it. A glow, coming from the cemetery ground, right where the sphere was buried. Pale blue light seeping up through 15 feet of earth, growing brighter. James grabbed her arm, pulling her back, but Rachel couldn't move. She was frozen, watching as the glow intensified, watching as cracks began to form in the ground above the grave. The sphere was coming up, and standing at the edge of the cemetery, barely visible in the blue light, was a small crowd of Glenville residents. They'd seen the light too. They'd come to see what had done this to their town. Sarah Mitchell was among them, holding her daughter's hand. They stood together in the darkness, watching the earth split open, waiting to see what emerged. Because after 3 days of silence, of fear, of impossible questions, they were about to get an answer. And Rachel had a terrible feeling that the answer was going to be worse than the question. The blue light grew brighter. The ground above the grave buckled and split, dirt cascading away as something rose from beneath. The sphere emerged slowly, impossibly, floating upward through 15 feet of earth as if the soil was water. 2 meters of perfect metallic surface, seamless, covered in patterns that seemed to shift and writhe in the blue glow. Rachel wanted to run. Every instinct screamed at her to get away. But she couldn't move. None of them could. 40 or 50 Glenville residents stood frozen in the cemetery, watching as the sphere hovered 3 feet above the ground, rotating slowly with a sound like wind chimes made of glass. Wait. Sound, Rachel gasped. The first breath she'd actually heard in 3 days. Around her, people were crying out, making noise, hearing their own voices for the first time since this started. A woman fell to her knees sobbing. A man was laughing and crying simultaneously. Sound had returned, just like that, the moment the sphere fully emerged. But Rachel wasn't celebrating. She was watching the sphere, because it wasn't done. The metal surface began to change. Not opening, not cracking. The material itself was flowing like liquid, forming shapes, symbols, patterns that hurt to look at, geometry that didn't make sense, angles that seemed to exist in more dimensions than her eyes could process. Sarah Mitchell stepped forward from the crowd, her daughter clutching her leg. She walked slowly toward the sphere, one hand extended, drawn to it like gravity. Rachel tried to call out to her, but her voice caught in her throat. Sarah's fingers touched the surface. The sphere pulsed, and Sarah screamed, not in pain, in terror, pure, primal terror. She stumbled backward, her eyes wide, her hand shaking. She looked at her daughter, then at the crowd, then back at the sphere. "It showed me," she whispered. "It showed me something. I can't." She couldn't finish. She just pulled her daughter close and backed away, her whole body trembling. The sphere rotated again, and Rachel saw something appear on its surface. Not text, images, moving pictures playing across the metal like a screen. But they weren't pictures of anything she recognized. Shapes, colors that shouldn't exist, perspectives that made her nauseous to watch. And beneath it all, a sound. Not the wind chime sound from before. This was deeper, a vibration she felt in her chest, in her bones, a frequency that made her teeth ache. James grabbed her arm and pointed at his equipment. His spectrum analyzer had come back online when the power returned, and now it was showing something impossible. The carrier wave was still there, still broadcasting at 23.8 kilohertz, but it wasn't alone anymore. There were dozens of other signals now, hundreds, thousands, all slightly different frequencies, all pulsing in complex patterns, all emanating from the sphere. "It's communicating," James said, his voice barely a whisper. "With something. It's sending data." Rachel looked up at the night sky, stars, satellites, or something else, something watching from up there, receiving the transmission, analyzing whatever the sphere had collected during 3 days of human silence. The sphere suddenly stopped rotating. The images on its surface froze. And then, for just 3 seconds, Rachel saw something that made her heart stop. A face. Not human, not anything close to human, but a face nonetheless. Eyes that were too large, too dark. A geometry to the features that was almost right, but fundamentally wrong. And the worst part, it was looking at her, directly at her, through the sphere, through space, through whatever impossible distance separated them. It wasn't curious. It wasn't hostile. It was clinical. The way a scientist looks at a specimen under a microscope. Then the face was gone. The images resumed their chaotic patterns. And the sphere began to sink. Slowly, gracefully, it descended back into the earth, the ground flowing closed over it like water. Within 60 seconds, it was gone. Just a cemetery with an old grave, grass already growing back over the disturbed soil, as if nothing had happened. But something had changed. Rachel felt it. Everyone felt it. Her phone buzzed, then again, then continuously. She pulled it out with shaking hands. Text messages, hundreds of them. News alerts flooding in from around the world. Video from Svalbard, a sphere emerging from ice. Video from Yakutsk, a sphere rising through permafrost. Video from Tasmania, a sphere floating up through forest soil. Video from a ship in the Pacific, a sphere breaking the ocean surface. All at the exact same time. All identical. All descending back into the earth after exactly 7 minutes. But the messages weren't the worst part. The worst part was the screenshot someone had shared. A satellite image of Earth from 1 hour ago. Someone had marked all 5 locations where the spheres emerged. They formed a perfect pentagon, precise to within meters. 5 points on a globe, separated by thousands of miles, creating a geometric pattern so exact it couldn't be coincidence. Someone had planned this, designed this, selected these specific locations for a reason humanity couldn't begin to understand. Rachel scrolled through more messages. Scientists around the world were already analyzing the signals, the patterns, trying to understand what the spheres had been measuring. There were theories, dozens of them. Social cohesion under stress, communication adaptation, psychological resilience. The spheres had been collecting data on human behavior when deprived of sound. But why? For what purpose? That's when she saw the video that made everything worse. Someone in Yakutsk had filmed their sphere up close. In the last 30 seconds before it sank, something had appeared on its surface. Not the chaotic images. Not the alien geometries. Just 3 simple elements: a circle, a number, a date. The circle was filled in about 20%, like a progress bar. The number was 1/5, and the date was 4 days from now. Rachel felt her legs go weak. 1 of 5. Phase 1. The circle was a completion indicator. This wasn't an isolated event. This was the first test in a series, and in 4 days, the second test would begin. She looked up at the crowd around her, at Sarah Mitchell holding her daughter, at James staring at his equipment in disbelief, at the residents of Glenville who'd just survived 3 days of silence and thought it was over. "We need to leave," she said quietly. "We need to leave Glenville right now." James looked at her. "Why? It's over. The sphere is gone. Sound is back." Rachel showed him the video from Yakutsk, showed him the progress bar, the date. "Because in 4 days, they're coming back. And I don't think it's going to be sound they take next time." By morning, Glenville was evacuating. Not everyone. Some people refused to leave their homes, convinced it was over, convinced the government was overreacting. But most were packing up, getting out, heading anywhere that wasn't inside that perfect 4-kilometer circle. Rachel stood at the southern boundary one last time, looking back at the town, at the church steeple visible in the distance, at the cemetery where something impossible had briefly touched the earth. Her phone buzzed again. Another news alert. Scientists had calculated the next 4 locations based on the geometric pattern. 4 more points to complete some kind of global grid. One of them was in India, one in Brazil, one in Egypt, one in Australia. 4 more tests, 4 more towns, 4 more chances for humanity to be measured, analyzed, graded on criteria they didn't understand. And the truly terrifying part, the spheres were empty inside. Sarah Mitchell had gotten close enough to see through a brief opening before it closed. No machinery, no technology, no power source. The spheres were just markers, beacons, the actual mechanism doing this, stealing sound, measuring responses, collecting data, wasn't anywhere on Earth. It was somewhere else. Somewhere humans couldn't reach, couldn't fight, couldn't even comprehend. Rachel got in her van and drove across the boundary. In her rearview mirror, she watched Glenville shrink into the distance. A normal American town that had been chosen for reasons unknown, tested for purposes unclear, and then released like an animal after being tagged and studied. 4 days until the next test. And somewhere above, or below, or outside human perception entirely, something was watching, taking notes, preparing the next phase of an experiment that had only just begun. The silence had been broken. But the observation was far from over. And the worst part was knowing that whatever came next, whatever sense they took, whatever tests they ran, humanity would have no choice but to endure it, to adapt, to survive. Because that's what the experiment was designed to measure. Not if humans could survive, but how long it would take before they broke.